dealing with, I tend to focus on trees that are focused in a very heavy urban setting. Trees, let me just get to the slide here.
Chris?
Yes?
Chris, sorry, I have to make you host again to enable you to do that. So I'm just switching over. Yeah, no problem. And you should have it now. No problem.
Okay. There you go. Share. Okay, having a challenge here, sharing the slideshow other than the reduced.
Could you try closing it and opening it again? Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, okay, here we go.
Take a second. Yeah. While we're waiting, I'd like to acknowledge our supporters for this series, not least of which is Gaia College, who's helped us maintain and make this series possible. And we don't spend money frivolously, so we don't have the super duper Zoom package, but we don't need it for now. But hopefully, Chris will get us sorted out here shortly.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Too many things up on the screen. How's that? Okay. Thankfully. Yeah, it wouldn't be a presentation by somebody in the green industry if they didn't go through that at the beginning. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to look at how trees grow and specifically about pruning. I know many of you will be fairly knowledgeable about pruning from a horticulture point of view, from a arboriculture point of view, and to put a presentation together that's going to talk about things that you generally know and have experienced, or you have studied, or whatever, is a bit of a moot point, and it would take 3 presentations to get through the basics. So I think what we're going to do here is I'm going to change direction on what I'm presenting here, just to dance around some of the things, and specifically from a point of view of what we know from a research perspective and peer-reviewed research versus anecdotal research. And the industry depends very heavily on anecdotal ideas and research, so a lot of them historic and through experience. But what I'm going to touch upon is just a couple things to get the thought process going on why we do some of the things we do. So if you were here last week, we talked about container grown trees and planting trees and how to sustain them in the landscape. And I'm pretty sure I didn't include these pictures. I hope I didn't.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah.
Just have to say your slideshow has not been refreshed. It's not moving.
Okay.
There it is.
All right. Do you see that?
I do. Wow.
Okay. Okay. So this is actually, we're going backwards to last week, but I don't recall if I had these slides available.
No.
Last week.
No, you didn't.
Okay. So we talked about container grown trees and issues with them receiving your tree planted a little bit deep in the container, which leads to planting it deep in the environment, and also the problem with circling roots. So on the left-hand side there, a good associate of mine pulled this out of a fire pit. This is a root ball from a Colorado spruce. It was probably 10 or 12 feet tall, and it had failed in the wind. Probably it was a wet season, and it went over, so it was pulled out and replaced. This is the root system, as you can see. So when we're talking circling roots, they do not naturally go back out into a heavier soil on their own. They have to be coaxed out when you plant the tree. So this is basically the container on the left-hand side that would have grown in, and it never stopped growing this way. And ultimately, the wind sail effect caused it to go over, and it will be replaced again with another containerized tree. Hopefully that's addressed better. The picture on the right is older but containerized tree, and you can see the lack of the root flare at the bottom, and you can see those circling roots. So this tree's days numbered. It's not going to give us the benefits that we're expecting from a tree over time. Okay, so that's just a flashback to last week. If I didn't have those pictures, hopefully that's more graphic. All right, urbanization and trees, just another perspective. This is Southern Ontario. This sort of thing's happening all across Canada. But we have in Southern Ontario, we have a places to grow mandate from the government, where we're looking at communities that can accept high development rates because they have the infrastructure over time, the fresh water, that sort of thing. And where I live is north of Guelph, a small community in Southern Ontario, and we're experiencing a 40% population growth in 15 years. Now you can imagine what the implications are on urban tree cover for all the new trees that go into this area. We're definitely working with limited spaces and challenging fitting trees and with hard infrastructure. I'll skip that for now because I know we're getting long. Okay, so pruning, it is a deliberate injury. We choose to do it. It disturbs the tree's energy balance, top to bottom, side to side. It reduces photosynthetic capacity of the tree, clearly, by removing leaf area. It reduces stored energy because those branches have stored energy in them that we're removing. And it could create a tree that's prone for failure if we don't do a very good job. And actually, it can accelerate decay. So pruning needs to be a conscious decision. We have to weigh the pros and the cons before we go ahead and prune. Okay, so just to cover some of the basics that many of you would know. Alex Shigo did a lot of research for the USDA in United States. And a lot of his work stands to this day as the foundation for how we prune trees, understand how trees grow. You may have heard of CODD, compartmentalization of decay in trees. And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically the premise is if a tree is injured, there's 4 directions that potential decay can move in, some of them faster than others. And the key one where the tree's defense is to limit the spread of decay is vertically in the tree. But at the same time, he came out with this. Other researchers, including himself, have said there's another thing going on with trees that we're just starting to pay attention to today. And that's the role of moisture content. And so when we look at decay spreading in trees, and a pruning has a big effect on this, as we'll get into. We've underestimated the impact of this. So if we look at this paper here, Origins of Decay in Living Deciduous Trees, And we read just the beginning of the summary. It says, it is argued that the development of decay in living hardwood can best be explained in terms of the unsuitability of functional sapwood, that's your xylem, for mycelial, that's your fungus, establishment owing to its high moisture content. So trees that have a very high functional xylem or sapwood impair the movement, the vertical movement of decay in trees. So what is the implications of that? Well, they're quite significant. It means that any reduction in leaf area may increase the rate of decay. And what would reduce leaf area? Well, of course, pruning activities. And the larger the tree, the greater the effect would be. So what's happening with a larger tree is trees transpire moisture by pulling it from the ground up through the root system, up through their sapwood, and out through the leaf stomata when they're open. It's a kind of a capillary action, or you might think of it as kind of a liquid vacuum that goes on. As the tree becomes taller and taller, to be able to pull this column of water up becomes much more challenging just due to gravity. And so larger trees are reaching a point where they can't do this efficiently. So if we go in and we prune a tree for whatever reason, it may have a hazard in it, or we might be doing something else to the tree. We remove the leaf area, we reduce the transpiration pull going up through that tree, and we weaken that barrier to the spread of decay in the tree. Now, this is something that we haven't been paying much attention to until recently, but now we're recognizing with large trees, we really have to make a conscious decision why we're pruning it. If it's to remove a hazard or to prevent a greater potential injury to the tree down the road by a branch or limb failure, we're trading it off now with understanding now that we've accelerated decay in the tree. And I'll come back to this picture a few times. I really like it because you're going to see I'm talking on both sides of my mouth at certain parts of this presentation. But here's a typical street tree planting in an urban site. On the right-hand side, where the gentleman's walking, ultimately, we're going to need 3 meters of clearance for people and cyclists and snow removal, small vehicles to go down there. On the street side, we're going to need 4 meters so that trucks and buses can pass by. When we plant a tree, largely, they're no taller than 3 meters, which means in this picture, virtually every single branch on this tree is going to have to be removed. Okay, so this is something that a lot of people don't realize is what a tree goes through in an urban setting. All right, so there's a lady called Linda Chalker-Scott. She is a professor for Washington State University. She's done an enormous amount of extension education. It's highly accessible, easy reading literature. And she studies horticulture, arboriculture, largely in sustainable landscapes. But she has kind of a cool thing she does, and it's called myth busting. So what she does is she looks at all the literature, all the research, and see what's actually been peer reviewed and what we actually know versus what's anecdotal. And this is the route I'm going to take here, just to kind of perk your interest and stay away from that general pruning. So a little review for many of you. These top pictures here, it's just 2 kinds of pruning. We have the collar pruning method, which is easiest to do when you actually see a branch collar, and it usually doesn't have a deleterious response to the tree unless you do an awful lot of it or the tree's older. And then we have the heading or topping cut down here below, which initiates all those dormant buds, which cause all kinds of grief. Now, we choose to do these different type of prunings for different reasons. Not all of them beneficial, but they're intentional. So what are some of the long-term effects of just general crown pruning? Well, it's a reallocation of energy throughout the tree. The lower trunk and the roots actually receive less resources for their development of taper and root growth. And it can lead to, if it's done excessively, to these epicormic shoots, which can be intentionally initiated, and also leads to susceptibility to pests. So one of her myths, and she's got many, and I'll give you a link to her work because it's actually very good reading. It's very accessible reading. One is building a better tree, and this is how we do it at the nursery. So we use that heading or topping technique very commonly at the nursery stage. Sometimes it's for something as simple as transplanting a plant to be able to make it shorter, but very often it's to give the tree the appearance of a larger tree, a miniature version of a larger tree, at least when it's out in leaf. Because typically in the early stages of a juvenile tree, they're going to be very tall and spindly. Ultimately, though, when it lands in the landscape, as you can see in these bottom ones, it's caused accelerated growth of other leaders and lower branches, which ultimately need to be dealt with and at an expense, and the tree will receive pruning injuries and will not be the tree that we want. Another thing, and this may seem very small, but it's actually a big issue in nursery growth, is there's these little short lateral branches that grow out lower in the trunk of trees. They provide carbohydrates directly to that portion of the trunk, and they assist in the development of the taper. Taper being the further down you go on the trunk, the wider it becomes, and potentially the more stable in an environment that's out in the open. And they also assist with the development of thicker bark, which is very beneficial to small trees that go out into the landscape because they're going to be met with herbivores and weed eaters and lawnmowers and that sort of thing. So typically, these lower branches are removed for aesthetic reasons when they reach the retail customer. So recommendations from, and this is based on peer-reviewed research of all of this, is where possible, let trees develop naturally, their natural habit when possible, and pick a species, cultivar, or variety which best suits the site rather than altering the tree to suit the site. If you have to alter the tree to suit the site, you'll be doing it for as long as the tree is likely there. And leave those little lower branches on. This is actually a very profound thing because it has a lot of implications for being able to guy a tree or needing to guy a tree if you don't have that taper on the trunk. And again, there'll be some sites in an urban setting where these recommendations will not be enough, and we're going to have to intervene. Again, coming back to this picture, again, basically every branch on these trees over probably the first 10 years of its life will be either modified or removed. The neat thing I like about this picture is you can see these small lateral branches on the tree. This photo or drawing is from the Urban Tree Foundation. I've got the information for you at the end there too. That's James Urban and I think Ed Gilman, and a lot of really useful information if you want to follow up on it. Okay, another myth, making angled cuts when pruning trees and shrubs. Well, it's a very common accepted practice, and typically it's a 45-degree angle. I'm not sure where that came from because It's no substantiation for it, though it is written in scientific literature. So this is what we do. There may be anecdotal reasons. I think, for instance, that angle drains water off, hopefully drying it out. Very common in shrubs, roses, for instance, but we do it in trees. And just to look back at how trees grow and the angle of a pruning cut, trees grow very interestingly. They grow from the tips of the branches into the trunk first, and I'm talking in girth, not length. And then once the branch is grown in girth into the trunk, then the trunk grows over top of it and encapsulates the connection. So that's how trees grow. It's very unique. The only sapwood connection between a branch and the trunk is this little kind of V-shaped area below the trunk. When we make a pruning cut on this, recognizing this, in order to stay out of the trunk sapwood, cambium, we have to make the pruning cut out here. And it comes close to, not always, but somewhat of a 90-degree angle to the trunk. When you see this swelling here, the branch collar, there isn't always a branch collar. We'll have a look at that. So what you have between the way the branch grows back into the trunk, then the trunk grows over it, you have this paper macheing effect that goes on over time. So that's the way we know trees grow and the effects of pruning them. Here in the center, you see a pruning cut that's left. It's not much of a branch collar, but you can see the wound wood healing over it because the cut stayed away from the trunk wood here. Over here on the right, that's a flesh cut, which is also torn out. There's one connection between the two, the trunk and the branch. Very weak spot, but the significant area of branch attachment for the tree. So we know all that, and that's why we do this basic pruning just very quickly. Most of you will be familiar with it. We make a little notch here if we want to remove this branch, because we know when we come out here and we cut this out here at the second cut, as it levers down, there's the potential for it to tear back to here. If that happens, the branch falls free. But if this notch is in here, it can tear right back and right down into the trunk. And we talked about vertical decay and trunks, and this will definitely accelerate it. Then once you have the main part of the weight of the branch off, you can cut close to the branch collar. So that's all the basic stuff that you're probably all familiar with. And again, this picture here shows where the branch collar is. It's here, and this is where your cut would be, almost a 90-degree to the direction of the branch, and staying away from cutting down here, which removes the branch collar and allows decay directly into the trunk. So again, some of the stuff you're quite familiar with. Now we arborists like to get really fancy with our math, and they come up with all these angles for making cuts. For instance, if we were to remove a codominant stem here, after releasing the weight, putting our little notch and releasing the weight, we would make a line 90 degrees across here, and then we would take a 90-degree down from this branch bark ridge, and we bisect it, split the difference. For some reason, we would make this elongated cut here instead of across here. We've done that, and it's been written into the literature for a very long time. But when you look at the science of it, there's no science to support it, because here we have a cut that's at 90 degrees to the trunk, and here we have one at 45 degrees on the right to the trunk. You notice the exposed surface area is much smaller on the 90-degree, and also the exposed perimeter of the cambium is much smaller. This could be 50% more over here. So it makes no sense, and all the science that has been published says this is the way we should be doing it, but this is the way we do it. So no published research supporting angle cuts. So in a sense, what we should be doing if we were removing this stem here, instead of finding this 90-degree angle between this bark ridge and coming across the trunk, we should have just cut it straight at 90 degrees, much smaller wound and easier to start closing over. Okay, so we're going to keep this picture coming back in because a lot of what I've said about don't touching trees is out of one side of the mouth, and of course the other side of the mouth is that there's not likely a branch on any of these trees that's going to be able to be maintained over time. So at that point, I'm going to give you a couple resources to look into if you really want to get into the details of all the different types of cuts and pruning and methods and what works and what doesn't. Go to the Urban Tree Foundation, which again is James Urban and I think Ed Gilman. They have wonderful drawings, specifications. Any municipality can use them, any homeowner can use them. It's all free on there. If you want to pick up a little book that's good for having out in the field, there's this one called the ABCs to young tree and small tree pruning. And also, if you want to see a vast amount of work on this myth busting, and it's more tongue in cheek, but there's a lot of very useful, friendly to understand information on the health of your landscape, check out Linda Chalker-Walker at Washington State University. So I'm going to open it up to questions there. I try to stay away from the majority of pruning stuff that you may know. But if anybody has a question, whether it's pruning or anything that's related to the last 4 weeks altogether, I'll do my best to answer. Okay, Astrid. I will stop sharing.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to start my video. Yeah, Chris, so I was just trying to get those links and to put them in the chat. And I'm not getting them. So,
okay.
But yeah, when you said, okay, so the whole premise of the 45-degree cut is because it increases the surface area of the cut. That makes a lot of sense now, doesn't it?
My assumption, and it's accepted, it's even written, it's a standard procedure. I say accepted, the 45 or an angle like that. I think it's purely aesthetic. And so if you were to do the 90 degrees to the branch or the stem, even though it's a smaller cut, it looks odd, more obvious.
Right. So aesthetics seems to have prevailed over the health of the tree. And now that our trees are suffering, people are starting to pay attention. So that diagram with the trees, there's certainly not enough clearance on what's required. 4 meters to the road for cars and trucks, 3 meters to the sidewalk. Why isn't that built in at the planning stage?
Well, that would be that is a great question. The nursery industry grows their trees in a certain way because of the public's and the contractor's expectation for what a tree should look like. They're not growing them to fit into that environment. Again, we're dealing with far smaller spaces that we're putting trees into. And it's just the reality that we live in a very vertical world as far as access around trees. And we can't always do all the things that Linda Chalker Scott was listing out there. Basically, leave a tree alone and let it take its natural form, let it shed its lower limbs, all that, in an environment that won't permit it, because you'll end up actually injuring the tree as a result. And so, and that's another point about pruning, is we prune now to prevent the potential for a greater injury down the road. So that's kind of the premise for pruning. Pruning, I can't think of a single example where pruning would actually improve the health of a tree. So basically, it's our aesthetics that we care about, or the fact that the tree potentially is going to be injured down the road, either by the way it's growing in the urban setting, which may lead to a greater injury through, say, a branch failure, or being hit by something, or at some time in the future we decide that some action is needed and we remove a branch that could have been removed 20 years earlier, and now the injury is double, triple, quadruple of what it would have been in the past. So young trees are far more resilient. We don't have to concern ourselves too much with decay if we can get them planted correctly. And then we get some initial structural pruning, or pruning at the time of planting, and in those first 5 to 10 years, it can almost be hands off with them in an urban setting. But that's the thing about what we do to trees, is we're managing their longevity in the urban setting, and at some point, once they become a little bit older, we're just managing their demise.
Yeah. Okay, so not that long ago, I came across some research, and I can't get my hands on it in the moment, but it was to do with the benefit of leaving deadwood on the tree. Of course, that's why a lot of pruning takes place. Have you heard anything to that effect in recent
Yes. Yeah, there's actually,
research?
again, when you look at the literature, there's really nothing there to say that, and a standard practice is removing all dead, disease, injured branches is beneficial. Now, in a younger tree, potentially there might be some benefit, but in an older tree, the tree biochemically knows how to deal with what's going on. And then a removal of such a branch would be more because it's a hazard. But again, anytime you remove a branch, you open up a fairly large inoculation site to decay causing organisms. It's largely fungus, and fungal spores are everywhere. The minute you cut a branch, they're usually in the air. There's nothing you can do to prevent them landing on that wound. The interesting thing is, though, there are beneficial fungi that can populate those wound sites and act in a defensive mechanism in alignment with the tree against it. So that's one of the things about wound paint and whatnot, is we want to make sure that we're not creating an opportunity to support to create decay-causing organisms under it, and we want the opportunity to make sure that beneficial organisms can populate those injuries.
Great. Okay, thanks for that answer. There's a question from Nick. Hi, what are your thoughts on wire basket trees versus potted trees? Would smaller trees and pots be better in the long run?
My experience, I like field-grown trees. So a wire basket tree would be grown in ground in real soil. It takes longer to grow. I find them more resilient in a harsher landscape than container grown trees. They probably take roughly twice the time to reach the size that you can with a container tree.
Ah,
And they're probably 3 or 4 times the weight of a container tree. So that's a limitation from a practical perspective for people planting. But also, you're not typically going to run into that circling root issue, at least in the heavier soils that we have here in Ontario. And you will sometimes find that they are a little bit low in the basket as well, but not to the same extent that the container trees. Container trees make things very practical, but they're also grown in a somewhat artificial soil. So you get that soil interface when you plant it into, I was going to say a natural landscape. It's usually not a natural landscape, but the soil interface when it goes into the ground, which perpetuates the circling roots if you don't deal with it. So my choice is always field grown, but from a practical reason, that may not be possible, and that's why the industry's moved to containers, and we just have to live with planting them effectively.
right. So back to then myth busting in containers. I know it's been a nursery practice to use glyphosate Roundup as a weed killer in the pots. And I've seen some studies to indicate that actually with young trees can contribute to sun scalding, and it's not the actual sun doing the damage of bark splitting on a young tree, it's the use of the glyphosate. Is that still a common practice, or is that a myth that isn't really a myth at all?
That would be nursery to nursery, and I can't speak directly to it. I know in the past, a lot of nurseries have used physical cultivation to control weeds. And very often, rodents are a bigger issue to young trees than weeds. Yeah, so I don't think there's a great argument for using Roundup type products. I can understand in a landscape where you're trying to transition from something completely awful, that a one-time application of something like that might be your only kind of way of starting a fresh landscape. So I think there's some things, we can't throw everything off the table. I think sometimes we have to use something bad to start something good, but as a perpetual or maintenance method, I'm not sure that every nursery is doing that.
Okay, that's good to know. So we're rounding out to our last minute, and another question here. Essentially, the way trees are growing, you're saying the trees have their own wisdom. They know how to shed their own branches. We don't really need to help them because that's essentially part of the growth pattern. Is that correct? Do we have that right? That's a question from Michael.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's pretty arrogant of us to think that we know better for what's going on with the tree, right? Profoundly complex to the point where clearly we don't understand their growth and how they interact with the environment. I think the thing when it comes to pruning is we're trying to keep the trees in the built environment for as long as possible. And that's quite different. A tree growing out in a park setting can live quite a different life than one on a boulevard or right away. And those trees should definitely be given that opportunity. But other trees that are just living in highly confined areas, if we want the tree there, and if we're not willing to settle for a small stature tree or small as we can get in there, we're going to have to modify it. And if we're going to have to modify it, it's got to be at as young an age as possible, because they're all injuries and we want the tree to recover as best as possible. So,
Okay.
that's what
Well, sorry,
Go
I just, this isn't really a pruning question, but it'll have to be our last one, Chris. But this darn volcanic mulching practice, when a tree ultimately has its flare buried over time, can the tree recover from that if we remove that awful mulch?
Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, well, that mulching technique has a lot of side effects. One, of course, is potential decay to the trunk of the tree. The other is it really pulls the root system up onto the surface. And so if we remove that, now we have a root system that's potentially exposed, and it's got to find its equilibrium going back into the level of the ground it should have been at. So we mulch. Well, I don't know why we do. It's an aesthetic, right? And you'll see it at a lot of big box stores, for instance. So the managers, property managers involved, it's an educational process. They get, well, the trees planted correctly, the trees pruned correctly in these box stores, and then the elimination of those volcano, because it really gives mulching a bad name.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. We've got to spread the word. Luckily, we've recorded this presentation. Thank you so much, Chris, and spread the word. For the life of me, I have forgotten what we're starting with next month. I believe it's food sovereignty and urban agriculture. So that's a new theme starting next month. I really appreciated having you join us, Chris, for the last 4 weeks. You're a wealth of information, and I'm so glad we have it all recorded. So spread the word. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Great.
Take care.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Lots of thank yous in the chat. So thanks, Chris. Bye for now.
Okay. Take care.